No, I think I'll be just fine. Um, if you see people falling asleep, then sign at me. It's hot up here.
Welcome back from lunch break. I hope you enjoyed the meal and the sun. Please just find a place wherever you wish to sit. We're getting ready for an intense afternoon. And I would like to welcome Yael Ohana. She's coming from an organization called Frankly Speaking, which is giving maybe an idea of what's coming up. She is going to have this afternoon with us, basically, and she's talking about what does Ray say about how Youth in Action works, and about how Youth in Action can work better. And I'm not going to go into more introductions because time is precious, so Yael, please.
Thank you. So, good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank you for having me here today. And I'd like to say just a few words about myself, just so you know where I'm coming from and who I am, in order that I should be able to, with some legitimacy, say something about this particular question. I'm a former youth worker. I work now in the area of policy. I'm sort of a researcher, but I've been working in the youth sector for quite a long time. And I suppose what's important here is that is for you to know that I actually haven't been involved in RAY, and I haven't been involved in Youth in Action very much. I work at the intersection of those three areas, and I've been asked for the purpose of this afternoon to take a kind of outside look, maybe with some fresh eyes, on the transnational study results from RAY, the various different studies that have been done. Some of the studies have been concluded, some of them are still in production, but I've tried to take a broad overview and try to understand a little bit about what the RAY transnational studies can tell us about how things work in Youth in Action. Some of the positive stuff, and maybe some of the stuff that we aren't always so aware of because things are working well. So maybe taking a look at some of the things that might be better, even if things are working well. So this presentation has essentially three main parts. I'll contextualize what I've done a little bit first, and then the main part of the presentation will look at the results of the RAY transnational studies. Not all of the results, because they really are quite numerous, but looking at different groups of findings that we might be able to learn from, that we might be able to infer some implications for the program for practice, especially from the point of view of practice. Yeah. And at the end, we'll have the opportunity to have a broader discussion, but as we go along, after each set of slides, there are essentially 4, there'll be a chance also to discuss in smaller groups and maybe to reflect a little bit on the things that I'm putting out there. We hope the exercise will take until about 16:30 altogether. I realize this is not the absolutely best time to have a presentation after a copious lunch and with the sun shining outside, but I ask you to bear with me, and if it's either going too fast or too slow, or if you're starting to fall asleep, then just let me know. Yeah. Okay, so what was I asked to do, right? What was I asked to do? I was asked to basically do 3 things. I was asked to look at the RAY transnational studies, and I'm saying that again and again because I do think we have to make a very strong distinction between the transnational studies and the individual studies that took place in the different countries. And as you will see as we go along, there's quite a lot of stuff in the national studies which probably would contradict even what I'm going to tell you about what I think are relevant implications of the transnational studies. So I was asked to analyze the results of the RAY studies conducted so far, to interpret what some of those results might mean for the practice of Youth in Action, and to highlight dilemmas and open questions which I think are significant. Yeah. So the important thing here is practice. Practice can mean different things, but for the purposes of this presentation, and I think it's important to make it clear when we refer to practice in this presentation, that we're not only talking about the practice of non-formal education in the context of Youth in Action projects. We're not only talking about the educational dimension. It can also refer to the practice of developing projects, or of developing partnerships, or of communicating with each other across borders, or of cooperating with each other within projects and across borders, or other things which maybe we don't always think of as practice, like selection and recruitment, conceptualization of key themes for the program, the interpretation of the objectives of the program, and different aspects of quality assurance. All of these things are things that are done and practiced in the context of Youth in Action. And of course, that list is not exhaustive by any means. So, RAY results tell us something, can tell us quite a lot of things about many of those aspects. But there are some things probably that we should be cautioned about with regard to how we read the RAY results and how we read the transnational studies. And essentially, there are 5 things that I'd like to highlight, which on the one hand get me off the hook when you don't agree with what I say, and on the other hand, I hope would help you to read with me the way I've read the transnational studies. So the first thing I'd like to mention as a caveat is that the RAY results were collected during the previous program generation. Okay, so in terms of applicability for practice, we're talking about a program that had certain objectives, and we're talking about interpreting the results of research about that program in relation to a new program, which frankly has relatively, they're similar, right, but they are different, the objectives of the new program. And there are some structural differences, and there are some differences in the project types, and there are some nuances around how those project types are evolving. So I think we need to keep that in mind. So not all the results and not all the implications that I've come up with will be really applicable directly to the new program. So we need to think about how to interpret that. The second thing is that RAY results are based on self-perception and self-reporting, and many people here are in the business of research, and we know how many pitfalls there can be around working with research results which are based on self-reporting. Quite a few of those pitfalls have been mentioned in the RAY studies. Wishful thinking on the part of project leaders, the projection of positive impacts onto the last project based on actually experiences from previous projects, and so on and so forth. And RAY has done a job of work to try to iron out those pitfalls, but they are there, and they apply also to the interpretation of the results. And it makes it quite difficult, as a result, to infer anything like causal relationships between the intervention that is being involved in or participating in a Youth in Action project and the life trajectories of young people who have potentially participated. The third thing, the transnational studies are based on the aggregation of national data, right? Which makes it makes it kind of complicated. And what you will see as we go forward, I read the billboards outside with the achievements of the different national programs, or at least in view of RAY research on a country level. Yeah, you can see quite a few achievements. And some of the things that I'm going to say will probably sound strange in those respects. There are certainly plenty of things in the national studies which are really context related and have to do with structures and cultures and ways of working which are different in other places, and therefore it's probably quite difficult to make direct comparisons and even to take some of the things that I'm going to say as interpretations at face value. So during the buzz groups that we're going to have after each set of slides, I would imagine that those are some of the things, some of the differences that might come out in your discussions. The fourth thing is that RAY results are largely quantitative, right? Whereas we're talking about trying to understand processes which also are largely qualitative. And many of the interpretations I make go in the direction of trying to understand more the quality of Youth in Action, because we're talking about practice, rather than the quantity of something. So we have to be a little careful about how to understand quantitative data in relation to qualitative outcomes, or the desire for qualitative outcomes. Ray results don't say very much, at least in my understanding at the moment, about the quantity, the level, or the quality of changes in behavior, for example, or in competence, or in organizational development. They do say something about that it happened, yeah, or that people think it happened. And there's a bit of a difference there. And then the fifth and final thing with regard to the caveats is that Ray results could be relevant in very different ways for different stakeholders. Yeah, and we haven't. It's not really for me, somebody who's not involved in the program, to say what that relevance might be for you who are involved in the program and know very well your local and your own immediate environment and context. So we leave the interpretation of what I've interpreted up to you, I mean, in terms of its relevance. Anything anybody would like to pick up on at this point? So, what aspects of youth in action can Ray help us to understand? We've chosen 4 main groups, although probably you could have grouped things differently, and probably there could be more, but for the purposes of the presentation today and the time that we have, we thought these were, and also what was coming out of the studies, at least in my opinion, we thought these were 4 important areas: project management, principles, learning, and quality. We look at each of these in more detail through a set of slides and through a set of statements, which I've developed on the basis of my reading. And I'll give some justificatory evidence from the studies for each of those statements. But then I'd like also, if possible, for you guys to discuss those statements together a little bit, and then maybe we'll get a bit of feedback after each round. Okay, so as I said, it's quite a lot of material. I hope that we can get to a coffee break sort of around 3 o'clock, and that will take us through 3 of the 4 categories. Then there'll be a 4th, and then afterwards, hopefully, there'll be space and time for a broader discussion. Okay, so a couple more things. For whom might Ray results actually be useful, right? I think here it's important to say that there are different ways of seeing the relationships of stakeholders in the program. I made a little diagram for myself because I thought it might be quite interesting to see what those relationships are, and those relationships also determine a little bit the relevance of some of the results that I found to be interesting. So the abbreviations, young people in the center. We would hope that young people would be in the center of attention of the program. Then the next circle, youth leaders, YLs, and youth workers, YWs. They're the people who probably are closest to the young people who use the program. They're the ones who do the educational work. They're the ones who develop projects with young people. Then the next circle, PCOs, project carrying organizations, and BOs, beneficiary organizations, and PLs, project leaders. The interesting thing here is that project leaders can also be youth workers and youth leaders. But project leaders also have organizational functions and can be involved in things like grant applications and so on and so forth. So they occupy a kind of a transitory or a transiting role between these different circles. And then the last circle, DMs and PSMs, decision makers and project support mechanisms. Yeah? So these are people who make decisions about the program. But as you see in this diagram, it may not be true in all cases and in all countries and in all places where the program is used, but they tend to be a little bit further away from the young people. And I thought it was interesting to see, in terms of the relevance and the usefulness of results, these distances and closenesses. And probably there are people and actors and stakeholders who move between these different circles. It's not a completely static relationship, but nevertheless, I found the concentric circles useful for understanding how these results that I will now present could also be useful to different people at different moments. No? So I've tried to consider also the positions in relation to choosing the different results that I picked out. So Youth in Action certainly has a lot to be proud of. Yeah, I think you spent quite a lot of time yesterday talking about and hearing about the different achievements of Youth in Action from the perspective of the Ray researchers conducted nationally and also from the content of the transnational studies. Really, there's an awful lot to be proud of. Loads of really positive results, plenty of, how would I say this, plenty of movement in the direction of fulfillment of objectives. And so, I mean, I'm not going to repeat all of that because there's really no need. You can read it in the executive summaries. But I think what's important here to say is that whatever I say next about different results, we're working from an assumption of relative success. Okay, so even the aspects which I might pick out as being counterintuitive, critical, problematic, whatever, challenging, these are still to be seen from the perspective of a program which has relative success and has made really significant inroads into reaching its own objectives. So, nevertheless, there's always room for improvement. And I think that's kind of the motto that that this presentation was sort of developed under. And when I was reading the transnational studies, I really went out looking for what are the things that to me somehow don't really fit, yeah, based on certain kinds of assumptions and acquired wisdom around how non-formal education works, how Youth in Action promotes non-formal education, so on and so forth. So, again, considering the objectives of the program of Youth in Action as it was before, not the new program, the old program, basically we have these 4 umbrella categories of data that demonstrates certain similarities. So somehow, data that's somehow counterintuitive. They challenge accepted wisdom about the effects of the program or about similar interventions. Data that in some way within the studies contradict each other. Data that indicate maybe that there exists a greater level of challenge to reach a particular objective, or that indicate a clear need for improvement because of dissatisfaction or low rankings, and data that raise what I consider to be interesting research questions, potentially for the Ray network and going forward. All right. Anything on what I've just said so far? No. Good. So let's start with project management. Just a couple of words before I start about the abbreviations that I use. Basically, I'm using the same abbreviations for the project types as have been used in the Ray studies. So when I talk about YD, I'm meaning Youth Democracy Projects. When I talk about YI, I mean Youth Initiative, so on and so forth. Because on the slides, the abbreviations appear, I may speak to them differently. So starting with the area of project management, I'd like to say the following. Ray results for project development and implementation show a mixed picture and some ambivalence regarding the achievement of objectives and quality. So what do I mean when I say that? I mean that, for example, in the 2011 transnational analysis, there were a lot of positive results for this area, especially in relation to the development of an improvement or impact on project management competence. For example, 78% of the participants say they have learned how to better plan and organize a project, and 84% of the participants indicated that they could contribute with their views and ideas to the development and implementation of the project. Okay, that's a great result. But At the same time, 70% of project leaders report that their organization had cooperated with one or more of the partners in the project, in projects funded by an EU youth program before. So there was an established partnership there. And while this is a good result, if you take it against the rest, it's a good result for the functioning of partnerships and networks amongst beneficiary organizations. It reflects achievements on the objective to foster European cooperation in the youth sector, but it could also mean that first-timers, i.e. organizations that have never used the project, are having fewer chances or maybe not gaining enough access to the program. Now, so there's a legitimate tension between the desire to look, we know that there's a tension between the desire to maintain a winning team, so it's worked before, and the risks implied by change, by changing partners, by opening up to untested partnerships. But coming back to the development of project management competence, these results raise questions around how organizations learn in YIA. As we know, it's often in the confrontation with new challenges, such as new partnerships, that learning is fostered. Okay, so for me, that indicates a kind of ambivalence. Another example, 90% of project leaders report that their project was well prepared, right? But on average, across all project types, only 66% of project leaders report that they had a prep meeting. Now, we know that that's traditionally an indicator and a criteria for a good prep process. Is that only ideological? Is that only something that we assume? No, actually, 60% of those who had, 83% of the project leaders who had a prep meeting reported that that was essential. Now, in addition, we know that 60% of project leaders reported virtual meetings as a way of compensating for not having a face-to-face prep meeting. But the question is whether or not that provides the same level and depth and quality of mutual trust, cooperation, understanding that's required to do a transnational project in the first place. This is not to say that projects are badly prepared. They're not. And it's not even to say that technology isn't a good alternative or effective for preparation. But it does reveal a tension between the efficiency demands that are on projects right now and the quality of the organizational and educational processes, or potentially now. In many cases, it's probably just a matter of people thinking things are well prepared because that's the way they've always done it and it always worked, without necessarily considering it could be even better. Something like, if it's not broken, then why fix it? So for practice, there are a few conclusions one could draw. In general, it may be a simple matter of promoting more awareness for the fact that we need to critically reflect on which kind of preparatory method we need to use in which context. Maybe it could be a face-to-face meeting. Maybe that's necessary more often when it's a new partnership. Maybe it's not as necessary when it's an older partnership. And maybe there are alternatives to face-to-face meetings, but which are not necessarily this typical sort of Google Hangout or so on. In any case, the point is, it's slightly counterintuitive, and we need to think about it. I have another example here, but I'm not going to go into it because it'll get too long. We can come back when we're discussing eventually. There are all kinds of other results that show that. Some of them refer to repeat applications after initial rejection, and so on and so forth. In general, we would need to know more about this kind of thing from qualitative research. It's very, very difficult to infer more than that it might be an issue, right? Or from the kind of results that we already have. Okay, any questions of clarification? Okay. So next possible statement with regard to project management. Approximately 20% of the project leaders report that the projects were not really developed in a balanced and mutually prepared way. So again, taking a slightly closer look at this aspect of preparation, which is a key dimension of project development and a key dimension of project management, we see that there was maybe a minority, but nevertheless, 20% is quite a sizable minority, who were not particularly satisfied with the way the project was developed. Now, this result refers to a perception of the perception of mutual development of projects. It doesn't say anything about whether or not the projects were really mutually developed or not. Yeah, I mean, we have to be clear about that. So it's not a statement of fact, but the quality of the relationships between the partners have not been studied by Ray. But nevertheless, this might indicate that, to a certain extent, the participatory approach, which is one of the very key principles of Youth in Action, is not as present as it should be in the development of projects between partners, in all cases, again. I mean, yeah? And maybe it also indicates that there are differing concepts of partnership between partners, and that's not necessarily something that's explicit, yeah? In a way, this result sort of has implications for the intercultural dimension of project development, right? Not necessarily the intercultural dimension of the project and between participants, but how organizations across borders with different organizational cultures and backgrounds and histories work together. And that might be something that needs a little more attention in the partnership building phase. Yeah? Without wanting to extrapolate too far, that's possibly an area that could require some reflection with regard to what kind of training needs there are in the program. Okay? Next slide. So, while the majority of project leaders in beneficiary organizations are satisfied with the application, administration, and reporting requirements, 30% consider this dimension difficult. Now, that's an even bigger minority than the last one. 2011 transnational analysis speculated that this might be the result of a culture of complaining, right? Might be. And again, brings us back to the how would I say, the not so easiness of working with self-perceptions and self-reporting. But when we read this result against the fact, and again, another result, that generally PLs, project leaders, and beneficiary organizations, at least the ones that were surveyed, they are more experienced, yeah? They weren't first-timers, they'd participated in the program more often. Then this starts to take on significance, because if it's basically a large majority of experienced project leaders and beneficiary organizations, and 30% of them think that the administration demands on projects are difficult, yeah, then it has another significance. Differentiating by project type within Youth in Action gives us a little bit more insight into this, I think. Yeah. Youth democracy applicants found their access to Youth in Action funding most difficult across project types, whereas youth initiative applicants found their access to project funding relatively easy. This raises questions about the differences in approach and actual administration demands between youth democracy projects and youth initiatives, yeah, that could account for the differences. Yeah, has it something to do with the profile of the applicants themselves, or does it have something to do with the actual profile of the administration demands between the two different kinds of project? Does being a first-timer have something to do with the way you perceive this? Do applicants who could be considered young people or representing young people with fewer opportunities have more difficulty with this? We need to find the common denominators between the people and organizations who find this issue complicated. I think that's an area that could be something for further research. it's interesting to see that training and networking applicants had the most favorable feedback concerning administration. They were the least dissatisfied. Yeah, Ray interpretation speculates that these project leaders and beneficiary organizations are more experienced. Again, the question that comes up is, if this is the case, then in which ways does that make them better able to deal with the administration and the reporting demands? What does this then tell us for training, right, and for other project types? I found it interesting to look at these results combined with others. For example, the results for inclusion of young people with fewer opportunities, yeah, i.e. the fact that there aren't actually so many involved, we'll get there, and that those who are involved tend to be the young people with fewer opportunities who have, among their peers, the most opportunities, so the higher level of social capital. And that many organizations and project leaders are repeats. Yeah, they are doing this again and again. Yeah, the combination of these results gives, it contributes to or reinforces a sense that the program works very, very well for organizations that could be considered insiders, yeah, but remains insufficiently accessible for those with less experience and less social capital. Now, again, this may not be the case in all countries or in all programs, but this is what this is what jumped off the page to me in the transnational study. So these results also raise a certain number of, I think, important questions, potentially for research, but also just generally for the program. What impacts might the difficulties some project leaders perceive with the application, administration, and reporting requirements, what impacts is this having on the quality of the educational offer within the projects, knowing that project leaders often have a hybrid role, in other words, a hybrid function. They often have both educational and organizational roles. And what impacts might this be having on efforts to open up the program to new beneficiaries? Are there, for example, amongst potential first-timers, is there a perception that we're not going to bother because it's actually all too complicated? We're not going to bother to apply for a project. And does it imply that there might need to be some more active and direct measures to ensure that beneficiary organizations can manage the administration demands of participation? There are certainly plenty of good practices in different contexts with regard to that. I mean, we know that some national agencies are experimenting with things like mentoring through the grant application process, that there has been extensive simplification of admin procedures, and that there might, in some cases, be a reflection on whether some legal requirements need to be, again, simplified. I think these results warrant a little more thought, and certainly inquiry country by country, because it's not always the same. But there's certainly, Ray could do this, but there's also mileage in individual national agencies and different organizations involved in the implementation of the program, using such results in their evaluation efforts, which are not part of the Ray process, as it were. I mean, just in general, with their evaluation of their own working processes. So that was the section on project management. Again, a snapshot, some statements, certainly not complete. And what I'd like to ask you now is in your current compositions, I don't know whether you'll find it easier to do it sort of in two groups on each table, or whether you can manage in such large groups to have a brief discussion of this. Can you identify with any of these points, right? How and why? And I can flick back. You don't have them on paper, which is probably a mistake. So, can start with that, and we can click through them. And so, 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes to discuss what you think, if you identify with any of these things. And I'll